Olivet Road, we left Tuxedo. You left Tuxedo there near where that Green River Fire Department and old cafe used to be and Camp Greystone and all that. So you started up back into the Zirconia community. So all that section, that direction, when we get up here to this stop sign, everything to the right is Zirconia. Ken Muir has built up into Zirconia and it's telling people it's flat rock. Sorry folks, that's Zirconia. So I don't know why they think they're in flat rock when they're in Zirconia. It beats me. They sold, Mabin sold it to them. That tells you right there it was Mabin land.
I think it's wishful thinking.
Yeah, it's wishful thinking that they're in flat rock. So when you go down here and turn left, we're going to be back into the Green River community, what the local folks are going to define as Green River. So this is going to be the edge of the Zirconia Green River communities. If you were to turn right at the stop sign, we're going to go left, but if you were to turn right, you're on Pinnacle Mountain Road through Zirconia. It's going to take you back down to old US 25 if you ever want to drive it. And on that road is Skytop Orchard. Butler actually started an orchard there back when, 30s or 40s? And he's got a really neat tourist thing there at his orchard for kids, a lot of educational things about apples and stuff. So if you're ever looking to do apples in the fall, it may be closed now, I'm not sure, but that's a really interesting one to visit. The Jones family lived in this section of the community prior to 1820. I've got them here on the 1820 census, and we know Wiley Jones's ancestors were born about 1815. That is not the same Jones as the Thomas and John Jones Sr. family I was telling you about earlier, where John Jones was out in the Dana Upward area, and his brother Thomas moved over into the Crab Creek area, and his son is Solomon Jones, who we'll talk about later. That is not the same Joneses. This is an entirely different set of Joneses that we don't know who they trace back to. We suspect it may be another brother of John Jones Sr. and Thomas, one that maybe went on to Tennessee, but we're not sure about that. And other people think, well, maybe it's a child of Thomas, you know, that we're just not aware of yet and have not documented to Thomas. But we haven't found that blood connection, so to speak. So this Jones family that lived up here is a separate group of people. This church was organized in 1870, as you can tell from the sign. The original church building burned in 1895. The second building burned in 1945, and the third building burned in 1960. This church has had 3 times the church has burnt. So this church was built after 1960. You can walk through the cemetery for a few minutes if you want. You're going to see a lot of Osteen graves. This was also Osteen land. Very early on, way before the Civil War, the Osteens lived here. You still see Capses up in this Zirconia area. You see the Kings, you see Ballards, you still see a lot of the Heatherleys, Beddingfields. All these are local Green River Zirconia people, local folks. When we recently, this church is doing a really good job of this cemetery, and they went through here within the last couple of years and began probing, what we call probing for graves. How many did they discover, Gary?
I've not heard that story. I don't know.
Well, we heard it at our last cemetery board meeting, and Leon will be able to tell you, I think. But I think they've discovered anywhere from 17 to 20 more graves by doing the probing and finding the old stones that were buried underneath the ground. Whether or not they've raised them all up yet, I'm not sure of that. But they are really working on the historical aspect of it. When we leave here and turn left on Pinnacle Mountain Road, I was hoping the colors would be really, really pretty, but I'm not so sure yet. If you do see a really scenic spot and you want to stop, make sure you have your directions. If you want to stop and take photos on the side of the road or pull off, keep your directions with you so you can catch up with us at the next stop. Because we wouldn't know if you were to stop and take photos. When we leave here, we're going to drive Pinnacle Mountain Road. We're going to turn left on Cabin Creek Road. I'm not going to do all the stops on that road. You are going to pass Mountain Valley Baptist Church on your right at Mountain Valley Cemetery Road. That was the old Pearson Ward Cemetery. When they first started that church, they called it the Poplar Springs Missionary Baptist Church, and then later in the 30s changed the name to Mountain Valley Baptist Church. They tell me in 1910, but we have found references to an old church in that Cabin Creek area earlier than that, in the 1880s. So I'm not really sure about the date of that church. But the graveyard is much older than 1910, and it's primarily Mabin and Caps's and Camp. Lawson Camp was one of the first settlers in that area. That's Sam's ancestor, the Camp family. Very well known for the Mountain Valley community for their vegetables and produce, and they were huge farmers in that area. You're going to be passing a lot of self-sustaining mountain farms still today. Everybody around here keeps their gardens. They do not go to the grocery store. You see how far it is to ride to the grocery store. They may not be farming and selling commercially anymore, but they're still raising their own crops. A lot of them do sell commercially still. You're going to pass Camp Arrowhead land. That camp was organized in 1937, also by the Bell family. It was sold in 1996 and again in 2004. You're going to pass the camp of Glen Arden, which originally started in Arden by Mary Bell in 1951, and later on they moved down here to the Green River area, and they sold it in 96. The very earliest land grants for this community were on Cabin Creek Road that we're going to be traveling. It was John Earle, E-A-R-L-E. He was a land speculator. He bought land down here as early as 1783 and 1784. The next earliest family in here was the Mabin family that we're going to talk about more when we get to our lunch area. The Corn family, the Capps family, and the Lawson Camp family were all here prior to 1850. You're going to be passing a sign that will direct you to the Pace Cemetery right before we get to the end of Cabin Creek Road. That was the land of Daniel Pace, who was in here in 1815 buying land along Cabin Creek and Green River. He was a son of Burrell Pope Pace, who we looked at the Mountain Page, in the Mountain Page community. One of his sons is Daniel, and that son moved and bought tremendous amount of land down here in Green River. Leon Pace is a descendant of Daniel, and Robert Morgan is a descendant of Daniel Pace. That Pace Cemetery has a lot of the Morgan family in it, because the Morgan family came up from South Carolina and owned a lot of land in here, and that is Robert Morgan's family and the Paces. The Ephraim Hart family was in here from 1830 to 1840, their first land deeds. That's H-A-R-T that I talked about at Zirconia. Ephraim Hart is buried at that old Pace Cemetery. At the Pace Cemetery is Robert Glenn Levi, who's one of our World War II heroes that died in World War II. He's at the Pace Cemetery. And the reason I'm telling you that is because we're not going to stop there. And the reason we're not going to stop is I had a choice. There's tons of old family cemeteries in this community, but I've chosen to take you to one of the, I think, the most unusual. And the Pace Cemetery is not that unusual. It's just like a normal little cemetery, not too far off the road. There is an old Holiness Church next to it, but it's a 20th century Holiness Church, and I think it's that Holiness Church that Robert Morgan despised when he wrote his book, Gap Creek. If any of you read that book, his horrible memories of going to this Holiness Church that's sitting there next to that Pace Cemetery. Holiness is not something that was common here in Henderson County too much, and there's not many Holiness churches here, but that was one of them, and it's a 20th century thing. We are going to stop at the Bain Cemetery. For those of you who may get behind us on this scenic tour part, you need to follow your directions really carefully to get to that Bain Cemetery, all right? So if you want to spend a few minutes, that's their community building that they've recently built, and this is another old-timey Baptist church of all local folks if you ever want to come visit one Sunday. My sister lives right up there, and And I got uncles living down there. So you may, and Gary King's ancestors, what is it, your grandparents?
That's my grandparents, my dad's
are right
father and
here,
mother, right there in front of
because
us.
that King family owned land down here too.
And the Osteen headstone right over there, that's my great-grandparents' maternal side.
Yeah. So you're
Charlie
welcome
D.
to walk around
Melinda
if you want
Osteen.
to, and whatever you want to do.
And they got destroyed, you know. It's my great-grandparents, maternal grandparents, parents of Anna Osteen, my dad's mother.